Okay, let's talk a little bit about infrastructure. You're going to hear a lot about infrastructure spending in the next 6 months. Certainly, you're hearing it now with regard to the presidential campaigns. Actually, it's a great story, but it's a sad story because there's nothing in more current need in this nation than the rebuild of its infrastructure. And this is something actually the House Democrats and the current administration, the Trump administration, agreed on 2 years ago that Congress needed to move on this. Let's talk about what's going to happen, but as importantly, what it really is, because we're talking about two different types of infrastructure. We're talking about above ground and below ground. When we talk about above ground, certainly we're talking about highways and roads and bridges, not just maintenance, but construction. Now, infrastructure is not a hard topic to understand and certainly not a tough issue to comprehend. The complications come with regard to understanding the methods and the formulation for funding infrastructure. In this case, when we talk about roads and highways and transportation, and we talk about bridges, all extremely important. When we talk about infrastructure above ground, we're talking about the ability to move people and product, which is absolutely the signal and a sign of a healthy economy. But when we talk about infrastructure, as probably most people understand it, we're talking about money that's gotten out of the federal government at the state and local levels, but these are insurgents of funding into those programs. In other words, these are based on taxes that have been collected in your gas taxes, diesel taxes, a bunch of different ways that taxes are collected, and then there's a formula, an allocation by which the federal government allocates to the states. Now those are federal highways. There are, I don't know, the federal government I think funds probably about 45% of everything that happens in terms of your transportation system above ground in the states. The rest is derived within the states directly. That's above ground. But for a lot of contractors, especially recently, we're talking about funding below ground. We're talking about water infrastructure, water projects, wastewater treatment, the things that happen underground. These are programs that come out of the federal government through loan programs. These are not straight shots of money into the states. I think I read that recently the American Water Works Association, AWWA, great folks, they had estimated it's going to take $1 trillion pumped into this economy, pumped into the states, to be able to maintain our water systems, water projects, in the next 25 years. And folks, if you're familiar with the types of loan programs that are available to states, we're nowhere close, not close to being able to fund that. The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, of which I'm not a big fan of EPA, but I take it back, I'm not a big fan in many ways, but there are a few things they do very, very well. EPA would argue that, I guess about 45 years ago, EPA had created, and Congress had passed, the President had signed, an environmental statute, what's called the Clean Water Act. I'm sure you've all heard of it. The Clean Water Act is probably, EPA would probably argue, is the most successful environmental statute in our nation's history, and they're probably right. But there are a couple of programs that impact contractors with regard to the Clean Water Act. One of which, and I've worked on the clean water for representing industry for many years. I used to work on, worked on for about 8-9 years, the development of language to codify a national wetlands policy in this country. But in the case of contractors, and heading into 2020, there are a couple of heads up in terms of what you should be focused in on. The first is what's called the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, WIFIA. Again, Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act. I term it WIFIA. Some other organizations down in D.C., they say WIFIA. Not into WIFIA. I'm into WIFIA. It sounds a little better. It has a little more cachet, baby. WIFIA is basically a low interest loan program, long term, that's available to municipalities to be able to basically fund the development and the expansion of water systems, water projects. It's actually in its infancy. It's only been since about 2014 that the program came into play. I think recently it finally lost its pilot program status. It's actually now a full-blown federal program appropriated by Congress. The funding is not very high. I think in 2019, I think that I saw that EPA had received, they say 51 letters, I say 51 applications from municipalities across the country asking for WFIA funding out of the feds to be able to help to supplement what they need to rebuild and not just maintain but expand water projects in municipalities across the country. WFIA is a fantastic program. It's somewhat new. It's not a very large program. It's not well funded yet. It needs to be. Industry groups need to get up to the hill and to the agencies to push the continuation of WFIA reauthorization and increase funding. Now, you may have heard, you may not, that WFIA is actually created and designed in coordination with what's called state revolving funds. And if you're familiar with water issues and water projects and the way they're funded, then you've heard of state revolving funds. That was one of the original creations, a component within the Clean Water Act some 45 years ago. So it's a state revolving fund, but also it's complemented actually by the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, WFIA. Some would say WFIA, which I hate. But if you want to read a little more about it, industry groups, anyone dealing with water should be up on the Hill now to continue to not just push for more funding, but to continue to educate lawmakers on not just the value of WFIA, but the fact that it has grown into a fantastic program. We talk about what's beneficial to small business or business, but this is actually a consumer issue, and all contractors should be all over it. The second part of what we may be facing this year that impacts contractors, it just impacts construction overall, has to do with what's called Waters of the United States. And Waters of the United States, when I say I've worked on an issue for 35 years, Waters of the U.S. is actually another component of the Clean Water Act. And it's actually a definition. Waters of the U.S. has to do with what's called, in the statute itself, navigable waters, which means permittable waters. The EPA is arguing, and they've been arguing this for quite a while, that when the eventual statute went through, signed into law, and went into to become a regulatory action, what EPA is arguing is that they didn't mean that waters of the U.S. only meant navigable waters. In other words, waters that are available for, say, boating and whatnot. That it applies to any type of water activity. That could be water in your backyard. That could be water, draining down a street. EPA is arguing the statute itself was not written properly, and that waters of the U.S. applies to any type of water, not just navigable, but any type of water, thereby then making it permittable. The bottom line is a land grab. It's a land grab on behalf of EPA, and industry has fought it for years. It's an issue that you're going to probably hear about this year. It's kind of hidden a little bit. I don't think it's really well understood, but its concept is actually pretty simple. But again, waters of the U.S. as it applies to the Clean Water Act, groups, industry groups, associations, firms, anybody having to do with any kind of water, construction, anybody who has to do with the development of housing or building of any kind should be very involved in continuing to educate lawmakers and maybe even regulators with regard to the opposition to the expansion of the definition of waters of the United States. I'm going to move on from there and tackle the next issue. If you ever have any questions, my contact is going to be made available. My contact information is going to be made available at the end of this.